We're going to be talking about public lands today, so I thought I'd start out with some crickets and some humans enjoying Zion National Park. Hello, human animal earthlings. It's great to have you joining us on Radio Free Georgia's In Tune to Nature program. I'm host Carrie Freeman, coming to you from Atlanta in late March of 2026. I'm excited today that we're going to be talking about our federal public lands in the United States and which of these 640 million acres that we co-own are most in need of our protection from a variety of elevating threats at this point in human history. Threats are not only ecological, but often political. This is based on a special news report co-published in Outside Magazine and Republic. Republic is a new nonprofit online journalism source dedicated to protecting America's public lands. The article is titled America's Most Endangered Public Lands 2026 and can be read at the website republic.land. To tell us about our most endangered public lands is the report's author, Stephanie Pearson. Stephanie is an award-winning travel writer who earned a master's in journalism from Northwestern University. She's traveled the world as a National Geographic explorer and as a contributing editor for Outside Magazine. She's also the author of multiple books on enjoying the outdoors, such as the book 100 Great American Parks and her upcoming book, 100 Hikes of a Lifetime USA. We'll also try to talk about some of those scenic hikes from that book towards the end of the show. Her website is her name, stephaniepearson.com. Welcome, Stephanie.
Thank you for having me. It's really an honor to be here.
Yeah, I'm so glad you're here. Now, first, tell us a little bit about yourself. Like, what drew you to make a career as a journalist writing about the outdoors and often focusing on public spaces?
Well, I grew up in northern Minnesota, and my parents bought land on their honeymoon that they eventually turned into a family cabin. And so every summer of my life, it was on a lake adjacent to the Boundary Waters. So I would spend my entire summer up there as they would build this cabin around us. And so,
Wonderful.
yeah, and later in life, I became a guide up in the Boundary Waters. And so I was really very northern Minnesota focused my whole life. But then as I went to college, I realized that I hadn't traveled much at all. And so then I really got the travel bug and wanted to see the rest of the world. And I think in National Geographic, I had seen a kayaker contributor photo, and it was probably like Paul Thoreau or something. And so then I realized that that's the career that I wanted. And so I applied to graduate school and got a job at Outside in 1995.
Ugh, wonderful. I mean, yes, I think it's a fabulous career that you've created, and you're clearly being rewarded for it with all kinds of awards. So, and we appreciate what you're doing. Now, how did you get this idea to work with the publications outside? Well, because you already work with them and Republic to identify the top 10 most endangered public lands.
So I can't really take credit for the idea.
Okay.
It was Chris Keyes, the founder of Republic, and he and I have worked together for more than 20 years. And so he really wanted to create this list because he started this new nonprofit publication, and he approached me, and he knew that it was sort of a big thing to take on. And so we really started in increments. Like I started essentially going on a listening tour, working, with people in this space, people from the National Parks Conservation Association, the Trust for Public Land, people in former administrations who had held, administrative positions with the BLM, people from backcountry hunters and anglers. So I just did this deep background research. And then from that, we started shaping our list from essentially this listening tour that I had taken.
And I know there are many threats to public lands, especially wilderness areas, due to ongoing crises such as species extinction, global warming, pollution, human industrial activity and sprawl, deep cuts to the federal staffing and budget, and changing priorities from political leaders. So how did you and maybe your other editors decide on the criteria that qualified a public land site as most endangered? Like what is meant by endangered?
Mhm. Well, endangered is truly that at this point in time. I mean, some public lands are literally wiping off the face of the planet, like Cape Hatteras National Seashore. It's disappearing. So we've got that acute threat, and we've got species that are going extinct before our eyes, and we've got other public lands that are being fragmented, very quickly. There's some statistics out there that are really pretty amazing. Like I think 4,000 acres of public land um, are being, are being destroyed per day, I believe.
Oh
I need to
gosh.
check that, but it's a lot. And so what we decided to do is just take some of these situations and use them as emblematic of the things that are happening on public lands. And these are just the most acute right now in 2026.
Yes, so, and to also show the variety of different threats, whether it's industrial activity or introduced species or yeah, and then you've got the climate crisis and all kinds of things. So I think you're also I can see in the list that variety of
Mhm.
different types of kind of acute threats.
Mhm.
Okay, before we have you go through a little profile of most, if not all of these endangered spaces from your report, first, I wanted you to just list the top 10 public lands and the main issue they're facing, and then we'll go through each of the 10.
Okay, so at number one is the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness in Minnesota, and that's a mining threat. And I have to say here that this was a choice by my editors. It wasn't because I'm from northern Minnesota.
Yeah.
And then the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and the National Petroleum Reserve, Alaska, and that's oil and gas development. And those are two separate public lands that are just separated,
Okay.
but they're two separate public lands and national historical parks across the country. So we couldn't really isolate this one, but that's based on censorship that's happening in these places. And Big Bend National Park, there were two really acute big issues there. One is drought. The Rio Grande River is essentially drying up, and then border security. The border wall there's a big push to build the border wall right now through that area.
Hmm.
And then Manassas National Battlefield Park in Virginia, and that's the data center issue. And this is one that is literally happening in all of our backyards right now, most of our
Right.
backyards. And then Red Cliffs Desert Reserve National Conservation Area in Utah. And this was representative of urban development. It's this really beautiful conservation area right outside of a St. George, which is a very fast growing town. And so that's why we chose that.
Oh, is
And
that
then
near Zion? Is that near Zion?
yeah, it's
Yeah.
near Zion
Okay,
and
because I just went there and so I was in St. George and yeah, flying over in an airplane looking down at Utah is really fascinating, but you can really see, because there's hardly any trees, you can really see the sprawl.
yeah, and it's growing very quickly. And then at number seven, we have Haleakala National Park, Hawaii, and that's species extinction. That's the national park with the most endangered species.
Whoa.
And then we have Rock Springs Planning Area in Wyoming. And this is a BLM land that not many people have probably heard of, but there's vast, vast areas that are under threat of being fragmented. And that's a big problem across the country. And then Angeles National Forest in California, which is a wildfire threat. And then Everglades National Park, which is invasive species threat. And that there are many, Florida has the most invasive species of
Huh.
any state. And the Burmese python is a pretty destructive invasive species.
Right.
So that's the list.
Okay. Before we go through them, you were mentioning BLM, and for a lot of younger people, they might have only heard of BLM in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement.
Oh,
But previous to that, it has been, or it still is, the acronym for the Bureau of Land Management. So can you
yeah.
also just clarify the other two federal agencies that oversee our public lands?
Yeah. And this is really interesting too. So of the 640 million public acres, um, that's 28% of our country's land mass,
Wow.
1.5 times the size of Alaska. Um, the national park system is 85 million acres of that. So that's only 1/8 of the pie.
Wow.
The rest is administered by the Bureau of Land Management, which has 245 million acres, the U.S. Forest Service, which is 193 million acres, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service,
Oh,
which is 95 million acres. And then the Department of Defense manages about 26 million acres. And all of these agencies have different levels of protection. So,
okay.
the National Park Service has a higher
The
level of
highest.
protection than, say, like the BLM, because in BLM lands, they have to manage it for a lot of different public uses, which includes,
A
you
lot of
know,
cattle
oil and gas,
grazing.
yeah, and
You got
grazing and things like that.
mining. Yeah.
Uh,
So yeah, a
yeah,
lot of people may not know about Bureau of Land Management because they may not seek recreation there like we do with the parks, or maybe sometimes the national forest. Like we have the Chattahoochee National Forest makes up a lot of North Georgia where we live
right.
in the mountains.
And
But
and then a caveat to that is that wilderness areas are another designation,
yeah,
beyond, and
like the refuges.
yeah, or wilderness areas like, federally designated wildernesses, which can be in like a national forest.
Okay.
So those have very high protections, and like you
Yeah.
can't even mountain bike in a wilderness area, or you can't use a chainsaw in a wilderness area.
Yeah,
So,
they're unlike the parks, which are trying to balance the tourism with the protection. The wilderness refuges or areas are supposed to, they tend to be more roadless and they don't really want as many humans coming in there.
mhm.
Yeah, so we definitely need more of those. Okay, how about we go in order and you spend just a few minutes telling us about each endangered federal public land on your list and summarizing what threats they're facing. So let's start with number one, Boundary Waters Canoe Wilderness in Minnesota.
Okay, so the Boundary Waters is this amazing chain of lakes surrounded by a beautiful boreal forest, very pristine, very fresh water, and people canoe via port. They paddle and portage. So these lakes are connected by portages, and it's been, the Anishinaabe have been in this region for millennium, thousands of years, and have used these portages, followed by the fur traders. And so these have been historic routes, transportation routes, like superhighways. And so the threat here is mining, and mining has always been a part of this region, but the kind of mining now that is taking place is sulfide or copper mining. And that water is particularly, when that rock comes up out of the earth, when it hits water, it has sort of a toxic
Oh,
reaction, and it's essentially poisonous to everything,
oh no.
so it's a very dangerous, when it's exposed to air and moisture, sulfuric acid compounds create acidic drainage, and they contaminate lakes and rivers. And so that's why this kind of mining is so dangerous. And the path of pollution flows north because it's north of the Laurentian Divide. And
Hmm.
so that's why it's so dangerous. But the reason it's so acute now is that a Republican representative from Minnesota just introduced to Congress, um, basically, he nullified this mining ban that the Biden administration put in, and then, using a novel interpretation of the Congressional Review Act, that prevents Congress from reintroducing another ban. So not only does he
Oh.
nullify the ban, it prevents Congress from, in the future, introducing another ban. So that's why that's so critical right now. And it passed Congress, and now it's waiting for a vote in the Senate.
Hmm.
And so if the Senate votes yes, they have the end of April to do that, then that opens the watershed to this kind of toxic mining, which is
Yeah.
very.
I'm going to be writing my senators about that because, yeah, I have heard about that in the news.
Mhm.
Well, let's discuss number two on the endangered list, Alaska's Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and the National Petroleum Reserve.
Okay. And so these two, a lot of people have heard of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. It's a massive 19.6 million acre wildlife refuge in the country, managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. It's got caribou herds. polar bears, Dall sheep, musk oxen, and more than 200 bird species. So all these migratory bird species land up there,
Yeah.
in the summertime. And separating just the only thing that separates that from the National Petroleum Reserve is Prudhoe Bay, which is, where there are oil fields. And so the National Petroleum Reserve is lesser known, but it's the largest block of public land in the country.
Wow.
And it was set aside in 1923 to provide an emergency supply of oil for the US Navy. And so the name is a misnomer because it's got as much wildlife as the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, and has got as much ecological value, and in that it's this big space that allows for migrations and all these things that need to happen in a massive space.
Yeah.
So the threat to that one is that in 2025, the day that President Trump took office, he announced an executive order unleashing Alaska's extraordinary resource potential, which again, is trying to open up all these areas to oil and gas. And again, the Biden administration had put a pause on these leasing programs,
Yeah.
but now that's being opened up. And so what that means is that there's already a couple of big projects up there, like the Willow Project in the National Petroleum Reserve. But the Interior Department has mandated at least 4 new leases. So that means, more road building, more, digging, more exploration, more disruption. And I didn't mention previously that this is all traditional lands of, the Inupiat and other people. And so this is highly destructive, but it's also a carbon sink. And so if all this land gets disrupted, it's going to, wreak more havoc on the climate.
Right. That's the irony is the places that are melting the fastest, like up in Alaska and the glaciers, are the places where they're mining for fossil fuels that they're going to burn to ruin Alaska faster. But
Yes.
that especially for native Alaskans up there, and then all the wildlife that is their home. And yeah, that's more important to me than the oil reserves. Okay,
Yeah.
moving on to number three on the endangered public lands list. Independence National Historic Park and lots of other parks that are currently experiencing government censorship.
Mhm. In this one, it was impossible to isolate one park. And,
Yeah.
this has been in the news a lot and people know what has been happening. But there's, anywhere, and this is again based on an executive order, President Trump's Restoring Truth and Sanity to American History, which is really aimed at purging federal parks and museums of displays that cast American history in a negative light. So that means anything about enslavement, mistreatment of Native Americans, LGBTQ plus rights, women's rights, climate change, or environmental protections. So, displays have gone, they've sort of slowly gone away, like the
Mhm.
flag at, in New York, the pride flag at Stonewall was lowered. And,
Yeah.
um, but there seems to be a specific emphasis on parks that discuss enslavement. And so part of this mandate was that National Park Service employees had to go through everything in their parks, like displays, things in the gift shop that were shed a negative light. And then they had to flag those things. And then now they've been mandated to start removing them. And
Yeah.
so, for example, at the Selma to Montgomery National Historic Trail in Alabama, where Martin Luther King Jr. walked with thousands of others to demand voting rights in 1965, they flagged 80 items for removal. And
That
so,
is ridiculous. Also, like that's the point, like resistance recording that racial justice injustice resistance is the point of that whole place, and now we have to just make sure that white people feel comfortable there. I mean, this is awful. I know that some people have set up databases where you can take pictures and upload them from displays. So I uploaded some, even though I don't know that these displays from like Glacier Park and the Everglades National Park visitor centers the climate change displays. I don't know that they've been taken down, but I went ahead and uploaded the photos that I had taken from last year and the year before because I find those displays about the climate change and how it affects the park and the wildlife quite interesting and important. And so it's
Yeah.
like I'm also hoping they can put them back up once we restore truth and sanity to what we're doing.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
and the organization, there's an organization called Save Our Signs where you can
Okay,
upload, and
that's
that's
it.
probably where you
Yeah.
did that. Yeah, and the good news about that is that some of these things have already been restored, via court order,
Okay.
or like in the case of Stonewall, New York City officials just re-raised the flag. And so that's, there are things coming back up and online again, but it's just there's no process by which, some of these things just may get lost.
Right, right. Let's move on to number 4 out of 10 on the endangered public lands list, Big Bend National Park in Texas.
Yeah, Big Bend, I think a lot of people might look at this list and say, well, the Colorado River isn't on this list. But one of the reasons the Colorado River isn't on this list is because the Rio Grande River is unfortunately even more endangered than the Colorado River. And millions of people depend on that, on the Rio Grande, for drinking water and agriculture. And that's a river that historically flowed 1,900 miles from the San Juan Mountains down to the Gulf of Mexico, through sort of the Texas, through New Mexico, then to Texas, and then, into the Gulf of Mexico. And it's in parts upstream of Big Bend National Park, it's now running dry.
Ah,
And it's very acutely endangered. And again, it's a migratory, stopover for birds. But but the second threat to Big Bend is that recently it was announced that this border wall, construction is going to go through that portion of Texas. And
gonna
at
like
first,
bifurcate the park or
yeah, exactly.
yeah.
And not only Big Bend, but there's also another, state park, Big Bend Ranch State Park. And there's still a lot of gray area around what's going to be a physical wall and what's going to be just technology.
Yeah.
And at first, on the Homeland Security website, it was marked as a physical wall. And now that's been sort of walked back in some parts to a technology wall. But this has received a lot of bipartisan pushback because this region is so rugged and so hard to traverse that there's no need for a wall here. And
Right.
and again, it's that, fragmentation, like, black bears, other
Yes.
animals cross the river into Mexico, and to have a wall there would just cut off so many species, you know,
Right. These
access.
walls are so ignorant of the way that humans are not the only ones moving about in this world. There's other animals that need to get there. We just can't build walls everywhere based on politics. So I've been happy to hear that there are a lot of people in Texas, even Republicans, who are not happy about this wall. So let's kind of try to keep on top of that and see if maybe we can keep that from being built. Let's discuss number 5 on the list, Manassas National Battlefield Park in Virginia, which is threatened by AI data centers.
Yeah, this is an interesting one, because really data centers are cropping up all across the country. I
Yeah.
mean, even, in my backyard, there's a it was just announced, it was under a lot of, secrecy, and now it's been announced that Google is behind it. And so this is something that's happening all across the country. And really what's happening is that there's very, very little oversight either by states or the federal government. And so all these big tech companies are coming in and, identifying places where these data centers can be built. And the state of Virginia is by far where like by, exponentially they're being built. And part of that is because the state has been giving incentives to build them. But this particular data center is the Prince William Digital Gateway, and it's the largest data center campus of its type on Earth.
Ugh.
And it's 1,700 acres with 37 buildings and a footprint 4 times the size of the Pentagon. And that's
Wow.
going to be adjacent to this famous Civil War battlefield where there were two major Civil War battles, actually. Um, and so there's been a lot of pushback on that as well. And there are two different lawsuits making their way through the courts. Um, and I think I think for now, construction on the data center is on hold until these lawsuits make their way through the courts. But this is one that is happening everywhere,
Right.
and it's a very visceral um, way to see how this can really affect people's daily lives. Noise pollution, light pollution, totally changing the landscape, encroaching on historical, really sort of sacred historical sites.
And people talk about also the usurping of so much water, and
Mhm.
water is a very precious resource. And so that can affect all kinds of wilderness areas and water that's needed for other, human activities as well. And then the greenhouse gases produced by all this. So there's a multitude. I'm glad you did include the AI data centers on there as a new issue that we're all facing to show
Mhm.
that it's going to affect public lands as well.
Oh yeah.
If you're just joining us on Radio Free Georgia, this is In Tune to Nature, and I'm host Carrie Freeman talking with award-winning travel writer Stephanie Pearson about her news report co-published in Outdoor and Republic, March 17th, 2026, titled America's Most Endangered Public Lands 2026, which can be read at the website republic.land, republic.land. And links to most of Stephanie's writing is at her website based on her name, stephaniepearson.com. Okay, so we're running through this top 10 list, allowing you to give us a brief description of each endangered public land. And we're now at number 6 out of 10, Red Cliffs Desert Reserve National Conservation Area in Utah.
Yeah, this is an interesting one, and again, one that a lot of people might not have heard of if they're not up to speed. And Utah's an interesting state in that it's got so much federal land and so many national parks that are iconic. And the reason we chose this one is because it's sort of emblematic of what's happening in the state, and that the state is really trying to gain more access to federal lands. But in this case, this Red Cliffs Desert Reserve was designated um, in 1996 as part of a compromise to protect 62,000 acres for the endangered Mojave Desert tortoise.
Ah,
But then part of the deal was that there could be some, development in other lands. And so because it's so close to St. George, which is a very is a area that's growing very quickly, they want to put a 4-lane highway through
mm,
this, and it's been rejected multiple times because, for one, the BLM has identified other places that this road can go.
oh, that's good.
Yeah, and so this is one that's, sort of one of those constant battles. And
Ah,
and so um again, it the BLM was mandated to revise its management plan to make, to make this highway happen. And um a lawsuit has, challenged it. And so because of the endangered desert tortoise, they aren't going to allow any essentially earth disturbing activities to happen until that lawsuit goes through the court. So for now the construction is on hold, but it's one of those things where um you know essentially conserve Southwest Utah, is at the head of this, opposition. And it's one of those things where if it happens here, it can happen anywhere because it's a protected area. And
yeah.
if these protections aren't honored, who knows, what else can be taken. So that's why this one's
It's
on
a
the list, because it's very emblematic of these places that, the management plans are in place, the protections are in place. These roads shouldn't happen here, but you know,
They're right. If they're going to put them in anyway, then what's the point of the protections? It shows they have no teeth. And roads, as we've discussed on this show many times, and with Ben Goldfarb's book, Crossings, roads are so deadly, really to all of us, but especially to the wildlife there.
yeah.
So, well,
Yep.
let's move on to number 7 on the endangered list, Haleakala National Park in Hawaii, facing extinction issues.
Yeah, and this one, this one is one of the things where one of the issues where you can really see it happening before your eyes. The National Park Service, Haleakala National Park, their website states that, certain species of the honey creeper are going to go extinct, in 10 years if something doesn't happen. And
Is that a
to back
bird?
up, yeah, that's a bird. It's a beautiful songbird, that was ubiquitous across the Hawaiian Islands. But to back up, Haleakala National Park has more endangered species by, many counts, than any other national park in the country. 81 flowering plants, 10 birds, 6 non-flowering plants, 3 insects, 2 mammals, and 1 reptile. But the big issue here are the honey creepers because they're such a cultural touch point, for Hawaiians, and they're going extinct. Some species are going extinct very quickly, and the big reason is because some species, if they get bit by one mosquito, can die. And so a mosquito obviously is an invasive species, and so the honey creeper's only recourse is to go higher up into the forest,
Where it's
where
cooler.
mosquitoes can't live. And that's
Okay.
been happening as the climate is changing. And so these honey creepers are living very high up, and it's only a matter of time before the mosquitoes can, live that high too. And so they're trying to develop, mosquito essentially birth control to, you know, make the mosquitoes die out and not be able to reproduce.
Yeah, now that you're mentioning this, I have heard of this. I think on like the Race to Save Our Vanishing Birds book might have talked about this. So this is an example of the climate issue affecting like these birds have nowhere to go on these
Mhm.
islands and they go up, but you're only going to be able to go up so high before the climate changes and the mosquitoes are everywhere.
Yeah.
So moving on to number 8, Rock Springs Planning Area in Wyoming facing habitat fragmentation.
Yeah, and going back to, when I had my initial conversations with all these conservation and public lands experts, one thing that a lot of them kept saying over and over and over again is if they could name the most endangered public lands, it would be BLM lands, these vast tracts of like American prairie lands that
Mm.
people think of as like flyover country or, like sort of dead lands in a way. But these places are so filled with life. And this one in particular is unbelievable in terms of what it supports. It's got the highest density sage grouse population on Earth, the largest historical herd of pronghorn in the continental US, and the world's longest documented mule deer migration,
Wow.
which passes through. And so it sort of ends up at Grand Teton National Park, and
Okay.
and is also, on the other side, it's the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. So it's this super important
Yes.
migratory corridor with all this wildlife that, isn't necessarily usable land, but the reason that it's come into play so so much now is that, again, there was a plan in place to manage it,
Yeah.
which included, um, which included oil and gas leasing. 70% of it was open to oil and gas leasing
Mm.
already. But what happened was in 2025, the US Geological Survey published a new assessment that proclaimed massive amounts of previously undiscovered oil and gas that is technically recoverable in the area. So that sort of pushed this move to redraw the BLM management plan to make room for more oil and gas development.
Ah.
And so that's why this one is so critical now, because again, there's movement to open more of it up to
Yeah.
development.
And you mentioned the sage grouse bird and the pronghorn. I didn't know about pronghorn until I went out to Wyoming several years ago. I didn't know we had like antelope type animals and that they, I think, are the fastest animal in North America. I had
Yeah.
no idea coming from the southeast, like, and so I was so excited to see them. But this is, these are the areas they pass through in the valleys and the grasslands and they migrate together as a herd. So, yeah, I'm glad you included grasslands on your list.
Yeah, and they're the most quickly disappearing lands in our country.
Yeah. Um, Almost through our list at number nine, Angeles National Forest in California, which is facing wildfire risks. When I think of wildfire, I think of California now with climate crisis.
Yeah, in this one, you know, nobody knows where fires are going to strike. But what is happening in the West right now is that the urban wildland interface has become increasingly volatile for a lot of reasons. And also, there's a new report out that fire speed has increased by 250%
Oh my gosh.
in the last 2 decades, and that's fueled by hotter, drier, and windier weather. And
Mhm.
where you've got these places where there's a ton of fuel, which is buildings, where you've got humans, which are generally people who are responsible for fires in a lot of cases, and then you've got this, dry fuel that is, and then you've got these really strong winds like the Santa Ana winds that created the wildfires back in, the beginning of 2025. And so it's not to say that, the Angeles National Forest is going to go up in flames faster than, say, the forest outside of Boulder, which is also experiencing extremely high winds. But anywhere in the West, particularly because it's so dry right now, that has these high winds, these amounts of human structures that can go up in flames, and also another thing that's happening is that, invasive species have overtaken a lot of these, and they burn faster than the native species.
Oh, I see.
So that's sort of the
Yeah,
situation there. And, the Angeles National Forest sits in an area with 20 million people, so there's just so much population there. Um,
yeah,
and so,
yeah.
yeah, if you look at FEMA maps, for example, of fire danger, Southern California is in the red often, and so,
That's
uh,
scary.
yeah.
Wrapping up your top 10 endangered public lands list is number 10 here in the Southeast, Everglades National Park in Florida. That's my home state. There's many issues, and we've discussed them on the show, but it also includes an introduced python species. And I know there's other introduced non-native species there too.
Yeah, this is so interesting. And sort of like Hawaii with the most endangered species, Florida has the most invasive species, and sort of the most destructive of that is, that might be debatable, but you know, is the python. And so the reason it's so destructive is because it's it doesn't have a natural predator. And
Right.
so it's, 90% of medium-sized mammals in the Eastern Everglades have disappeared. And, you know, largely probably because of the python. And that's not a documentable fact, but they're gone and the python has no predator. And also they suspect there to be way more pythons than anybody knows because they blend in so well and they reproduce so quickly.
Yeah.
And so between those two things, they're just really changing the ecosystem.
Yeah.
Um,
Because the alligators used to be the kind of the top predator, and now alligators, some of them, based on depending on how big they are, can't defend themselves because this is like a boa constrictor type
Mhm.
animal. And so, yeah, I normally don't like to demonize species that are introduced because it's not like they're trying to be harmful. It's just that they're now in this space. but it is a really big problem that like the raccoons and the rabbits and the deer, they cannot survive in the Everglades anymore and they're just gone. So how is
Mhm.
that going to change everything else?
Yeah.
So yeah. I don't know what it is about South Florida, but I think people get these exotic species as pets and then they just think, oh, Florida's warm, and then they just let out all these toads and snakes and birds and different things and lizards and iguanas, and then they're really disruptive,
Hmm.
to the ecosystem. Well,
Yes.
Stephanie, since most of our that was our top 10 list, but I
Mhm.
was going to say as a wrap up, most of our listeners are co-owners of America's public lands and they have a vested interest. So what can they do? What can we do to protect these lands that we all own along with the wild animal residents?
Well, I would say, the first thing is to become educated. Don't take my word for it. Do your own research and also, um, look at your own backyard. What are the things you love? Where are the places you play? And start researching what's happening in those places. There are things happening everywhere. And then I also would, and then find out what organizations are doing what to protect
Right.
them. And there are organizations, there are multiple organizations for any of these issues, and
Yeah.
some of them, do more sort of legal work, some of them do more volunteering work. And so there are many ways you can participate. You can spend your time, you can spend your money, you can, and but then you can also get more politically involved. And
Yeah.
people so often think, oh, this is happening in Nevada, it doesn't affect me. But the reason that it's important is because some of the ways these protections are being unraveled is because politicians across the country are using the same, like the Congressional Review Act,
The
to undo.
playbook,
Yeah,
the
they're
same
using the same
trick.
playbook. And so people need to, let's say you've never been to the Boundary Waters, or let's say you've been there once, but if you care about it, you can call your senator, because that allows the people who are doing the work in Washington to get through the door of your senator to
Mm,
make the case for why this needs to be protected. Because if
yeah.
people don't speak up about these issues, they don't get the attention in Washington, and that's
Right.
that's how policy changes. We need the
Yeah.
eyeballs of, the senators and the congressmen, so that they can go to bat for these things and understand why they're important and understand what it means to lose these places. And so if you really value a place, get involved in the
Yeah.
policy. And, one of the guys I interviewed from Backcountry Hunters and Anglers, he said, hunters think that they're doing conservation work by buying a tag or by buying a license, because some of that money you know, goes to fighting for these things. But we're at a point where that's just not enough anymore. Like, you have to speak up
Advocate.
and
Yeah.
advocate for the places that you love, because you can't take for granted that they're going to be there for your kids
Yeah.
or
And
your grandchildren. And not that that's, you know, there's something that is called bequest value.
yeah.
And bequest value means that, you may never see the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, but it's important as an American to know that these big wild places exist, because that's really part of what it means to be an American, really. And
Yeah.
so even if you may never see them, it's important to our collective psyche that they're there.
Yeah, I really appreciate that because it's not about us and our tourism and so we can see these things. It's because first of all, I think it's most important that these are the homes and habitats of so many wild animals and some human communities, sometimes native human communities. And so it's important to them. And this is all the fabric of our collective climate, our collective environment. And so the more species that go extinct all over the world, the more we're unraveling, our the ecosystems that we all need to survive. And honestly, it's just unfair. So, yeah, paying attention to politics and paying attention to the stances of people that you vote for, I think are really important.
And just the last thing I would say is enjoy these places.
Yeah.
Just go out and be in them and recreate in them and, just feel the joy that they bring.
Yeah, because like I don't own any land privately because I rent, but it's like, oh, I actually am a landowner. And
Mhm.
I have apparently 640 million acres of public land, not to mention the state and local lands. And so it's like, if you think about it that way, that creates maybe more investment from us. Yeah.
Yes.
Stephanie, before we wrap up, I'm excited for your latest book coming out soon in 2026. It's called 100 Hikes of a Lifetime USA, the country's ultimate scenic trails. I'm curious whether you got to go on all of these trails. Like, how did you pick out 100?
Well, that is the number one question that I get asked. And I did not go on all of them, but I have hiked probably, I'd say 60% of them over the
Yeah.
course of my life. But I did do a lot of reporting on this.
Yeah.
And one of the joys, and I did go on a massive road trip
Oh,
and
that's good. I mean, I wanted you to have some fun on this
yeah,
book.
so I
Yeah.
linked together all these different, trails across, a good portion of the
Yeah.
country. And it was a blast and definitely some of the most fun I've had while reporting. Um, but um, but one of the things about this book that I love so much is I got to talk to so many people whose life's passions are these trails and what
Yeah.
they've done to create these trails and what they continue to do. And it really made me appreciate all of the people who make these trails so that we can enjoy them.
Yeah. And I'm one of those hikers that just likes to meander and take photos and go on shorter hikes, like 2 to 4 miles and without major elevation gain. I don't want to brag about how lazy I am, but I love being outdoors and I love hiking, but I just kind of want an easy scenic trail. So are
Yeah.
there any epic but easy hikes in your book?
Well, I would have to say yes. And one
Yeah.
of the criteria, I included a trail in each state. And
Oh,
so,
nice.
they're not all mountain trails and they're
Yeah.
not, and some of them are by the ocean and some of them are very short. And some of them are culturally important, like the Wanderer Memory Trail.
Hmm.
About this essentially ship of enslaved people that wrecked on this coastline um, on the east coast. And so it's just a short interpretive trail.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of different kinds of epics, I
Yeah.
would say. And then there's the super super tough trails, like the Continental Divide Trail and the Pacific Crest Trail and the big ones too,
Yeah.
because those are so iconic. But
Yeah.
it's a really good mix and an interesting mix of geography and landscape and culture and yeah, it was just really fun to report it.
Oh yeah, and how beautiful. I haven't seen the book yet, but those kind of books with all the photography is, I think I'm really looking forward to that.
Yeah, I'm excited to see it. I haven't actually
Yeah.
seen the book yet, so I'm excited to see it.
That's the end of our show, but I want to thank you, Stephanie Pearson, for being with us on Radio Free Georgia's In Tune to Nature program. Thanks for encouraging us to stay connected to the outdoors and to protect America's precious but imperiled public lands so that we don't take them for granted.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been fun.
Yeah. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in to In Tune to Nature, broadcasting every Wednesday at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, online at wrfg.org and on Atlanta radio station 89.3 FM. I record from Atlanta in the foothills of the Appalachia Mountains, in the Muskogee Creek Territory, and former range of the Red Wolf, now home to some coyote families and a million squirrels. You can access action items, news, and podcasts on the show's website, wrfg.org/intune to nature. The views and opinions expressed on this show do not necessarily reflect those of WRFG, its board staff, or volunteers. I'm one of those volunteers. I'm host Carrie Freeman, asking you to please support independent, non commercial media like Radio Free Georgia at wrfg.org. And remember to take care of yourself and others, including other species, many of whom depend on protection of our public lands for their survival. Thank you for listening. Cheers. What do you all think of the administration and DOJ cutting the National Park Service employee jobs and funding to our national parks.
Boo! Boo hiss!
That's what I thought. Thank you.